A mother's worry. Marian Dawson tapped her fingers anxiously on the steering wheel as she waited in the school's pickup line. Her eyes flickered to the entrance of the school, watching the children rush out, laughing and chatting in groups. Her son, Eric, was never among them. Finally, she spotted him, walking slowly, head down, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He didn't talk to anyone, didn't wave goodbye. He just moved like a shadow, unnoticed, unseen. As he reached the car, she forced a smile. "Hey, sweetheart, how was school today?" Eric slid into the passenger seat and pulled the door shut. "Fine," he mumbled, staring out the window. It wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for weeks. Marian had hoped the move would give Eric a fresh start. New house, new school, new friends. But instead of opening up, he had closed himself off even more. Gone was the bright-eyed boy who used to chatter endlessly about dinosaurs and space missions. Now, silence followed him like a dark cloud. As she pulled out of the parking lot, Marian stole glances at him. He was gripping his backpack strapped tightly, his knuckles white. "Did anything happen today?" she pressed gently. "No," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. That was always his answer. "No, nothing happened. No, everything was fine. No, I don't need help." But Marian saw the truth, the little changes, how he never met her eyes anymore, how he flinched when she reached out to touch his shoulder, how he spent hours in his room, staring at the same page in his notebook without writing a word. Something was wrong, and she needed to find out what. A quiet boy with a heavy heart. That evening, Marian watched Eric as he sat at the kitchen table, absently pushing his peas around his plate. He hadn't taken a single bite. "You're not hungry?" she asked. "I guess." "Sweetie." She hesitated. She didn't want to push too hard, but the worry in her chest was suffocating. "Is there something going on at school? Are the kids being mean to you?" Eric shook his head. "No." But she caught it, that tiny flicker of hesitation in his voice. "Eric, you can talk to me," she urged. "You know that, right?" He nodded, but his eyes stayed down, locked onto his untouched dinner. Marian's stomach twisted. She had spent the past few weeks trying to give him space, hoping he would open up on his own. But every day, the distance between them grew wider. It wasn't just school. It was his whole world, and she couldn't bear to watch her son disappear into silence. That night, after Eric had gone to bed, Marian sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of tea in front of her. She needed answers. Calling the school felt useless. She had spoken to the teacher already, and they had assured her that Eric was doing fine. They saw no signs of bullying, no red flags. But she knew better. There was only one way to find out the truth. She pulled out her laptop and searched for something discreet, something small enough to fit in Eric's backpack. A camera. As soon as the idea crossed her mind, guilt followed right behind it. Would it be wrong? A betrayal of trust. But then she thought about the haunted look in her son's eyes. If Eric wouldn't tell her what was happening, she would have to see it for herself. With a deep breath, she clicked "Order now." She prayed she wasn't making a mistake. The first recording. The next morning, Marian slipped the tiny camera into the front pocket of Eric's backpack before sending him off to school. All day, she felt like she was holding her breath, waiting for him to come home, waiting to see what the camera had captured. When Eric walked through the door that afternoon, he looked the same as always, quiet, withdrawn. But Marian noticed something different. His backpack. He was gripping it tighter than usual, like he was protecting something inside. Had he found the camera? Her heart pounded. But he said nothing, just muttered a quick "Hi, Mom" before retreating to his room. That night, after Eric had gone to sleep, Marian retrieved the backpack and took out the camera. Her hands trembled as she plugged it into her laptop. The video started playing. At first it was just normal school life, the sound of shuffling books, the chatter of kids in the classroom. She saw Eric sitting at his desk, his shoulders hunched as he scribbled in his notebook. Then something caught her eye. A boy, a bigger one, leaned over from the desk behind Eric and whispered something in his ear. Marian couldn't hear it clearly, but she saw the way Eric's face changed, how he stiffened, how he gripped his pencil so hard his knuckles turned white. Then the boy snatched something from Eric's desk. A book. Eric reached for it, but the boy yanked it away, smirking as he flipped through the pages. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the book onto the floor. Marian's breath caught. Eric hesitated, glancing around before bending down to pick it up. The teacher wasn't looking. None of the other kids said anything. Then, as Eric straightened, the boy's foot shot out. A sharp, deliberate trip. Eric stumbled, catching himself on the desk. His face burned with humiliation. The boy just laughed. And the worst part, so did the others. A mother's heartbreak. Marian covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes brimming with tears. This wasn't just a bad day. This was something deeper, something cruel. The other kids, they weren't helping him. They were laughing. And the teacher, he hadn't even noticed. Marian's fingers curled into fists. Her son wasn't just struggling. He was suffering. And she had let it go on for too long. She had thought maybe she was imagining things, that maybe Eric just needed time to adjust. But no, this was real. This was happening every single day. And she was done waiting. She was done hoping things would get better on their own. Tomorrow, she was going to the school. And she was going to make sure that no one ever hurt her son again. A mother's fury. Marian barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. Eric flinching, the book hitting the floor, the way the other kids laughed like his pain was a joke. Her son had been suffering in silence, and she had let it happen. But no more. She had woken up with one thought on her mind. This ends today. She spent the morning watching Eric closely. He moved like a ghost through their morning routine, brushing his teeth, packing his bag, eating his breakfast without a word. It was like he was trying to take up as little space as possible, like he had learned that being invisible was the safest option. Marian's heart ached, but she forced a smile as she handed him his lunch. "I'll see you later, sweetheart," she said. Eric only nodded, his eyes already distant. But today was different, because today Marian wasn't just dropping him off. She was staying. Walking into the lion's den, Marian pulled into the school parking lot and took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what she expected, a fight, an argument, a long list of excuses. But she didn't care. She was here for one reason, to protect her son. The front office was buzzing with early morning activity. Teachers grabbing papers, parents checking in, students running in late. But Marian only had eyes for one person. The principal. Mrs. Carolyn Peterson sat behind her desk, flipping through a folder when Marian stepped inside. She looked up, her expression polite but distant. "Mrs. Dawson," she greeted. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Yes," Marian said, gripping the chair in front of her desk. "We need to talk about my son." Mrs. Peterson sighed as if she had already heard every complaint a parent could bring her. "Of course. What seems to be the issue?" Marian reached into her purse and pulled out the USB drive. She placed it on the desk. "I need you to watch this," she said, her voice shaking with restrained anger. Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows lifted, but she took the drive and inserted it into her computer. As the video played, Marian watched the principal's face. At first, her expression was neutral. But then came the moment. The book being snatched, the trip, the laughter. And Marian saw it. The change. The tightening of Mrs. Peterson's mouth. The small crease between her eyebrows. She was seeing it too. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled. This is troubling," she admitted. Marian's heart pounded. "Troubling," she repeated. "That's all you have to say. That's my son being bullied. And you're calling it troubling. Mrs. Peterson hesitated, folding her hands on the desk. I understand that this is upsetting. No, Marian cut in. You don't understand. My son has been suffering for weeks. He comes home quiet, afraid to talk about school. He flinches when I ask him if he's okay. And now I know why. She pointed at the screen. This isn't just some kid being mean. This is a pattern. A group of kids targeting Eric. And the teacher doesn't even notice. Mrs. Peterson sighed again, like this was all so inconvenient for her. Mrs. Dawson, school policies require that we conduct a full investigation before taking action. Marian's hands clenched into fists. An investigation. How much evidence did they need? Her son's bruised spirit wasn't enough. She leaned forward, her voice low and dangerous. My son doesn't have time for your investigation, she said. Fix this. Now, Mrs. Peterson hesitated. Marian could tell she was weighing her options, trying to decide if this problem could be swept under the rug like so many others. But Marian wasn't going to let that happen. Because she wasn't just any parent. She was Eric's mother. And she was ready to burn the school to the ground, if that's what it took to protect him. Finally, after what felt like forever, Mrs. Peterson nodded. I'll speak with his teacher immediately, she said. And the students involved. Good, Marian said. Because if this happens again, I won't just be sitting in your office. I'll be talking to the school board. And if that doesn't work, the news. She stood up, her heart pounding. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. She had done something. And now, it was time to make sure it never happened again. The teacher's response. Later that afternoon, Marian sat in a small conference room, waiting for Eric's teacher, Mr. Roberts. She had no idea what to expect. Would he deny it? Make excuses? Try to shift the blame? The door opened, and a tall, tired-looking man in his 50s stepped inside. His brown suit was a little wrinkled, his tie slightly crooked. He looked like a man who had spent too many years dealing with too many kids. Mrs. Dawson, he greeted, sitting across from her. I hear you have some concerns. Marian took a deep breath. She wasn't here to argue. She was here for Eric. My son is being bullied, she said firmly. And you haven't noticed. Mr. Roberts frowned. If I had seen anything. But you didn't see anything, she cut in. And that's the problem. She slid the USB drive toward him. Watch. The room was silent as the video played. Marian didn't look at the screen this time. She looked at him. Watched the way his jaw tensed, the way his fingers tightened into a fist. When the video ended, he let out a slow breath. I had no idea, he admitted. I'm sorry. Marian blinked, caught off guard. She had expected defensiveness, dismissal. But this was something else. Regret. This isn't just about Eric, Marian said after a moment. If this is happening to him, it's happening to other kids too. Maybe kids who aren't speaking up. Mr. Roberts nodded. You're right. He ran a hand through his graying hair. I need to do better. Marian studied him for a moment. Then do it. He met her eyes. I will. The change begins. The next morning, Marian sat in her car outside the school, watching as Eric hesitated near the entrance. He knew something was different. Marian had told him that she had spoken to the school, but she hadn't gone into details. She didn't want to give him false hope. But then, something happened. One of the boys from the video, the one who had tripped Eric, walked up to him. Marian's breath caught. Was it about to happen again? The boy hesitated. Then, without meeting Eric's eyes, he mumbled something. Eric froze. Then, slowly, he nodded, and the boy walked away. Marian let out a shaky breath. A small step, but a step nonetheless. And as Eric finally walked inside the school, his shoulders just a little less slumped than before, Marian knew one thing for sure. She wasn't done fighting. Not until her son could walk through those doors without fear. Not until he was truly safe. Not until he was happy again. And no matter what it took, she would make that happen. The battle is not over. Marian felt the tight knot in her chest loosen just a little as she watched Eric walk into the school that morning. It wasn't a miracle overnight. He wasn't suddenly smiling and skipping down the halls. But there was something different. The way his shoulders weren't as hunched. The way his steps were just a little steadier. The way that one boy, Jason, if she remembered correctly, had actually spoken to him instead of just laughing at his pain. It was a start. But Marian knew better than to think it was over. One apology wasn't enough. One meeting with the principal wouldn't fix everything. She needed to make sure the school followed through. That Eric's teacher actually did something. That the kids who had laughed at his suffering learned something. Because Marian knew how this worked. Too often, schools pushed bullying under the rug. They handed out half-hearted punishments and called it a day, hoping the problem would go away on its own. But this was her son's life, and she wasn't about to let it be dismissed like some minor inconvenience. The school's attempt at change. That afternoon, Marian walked into the school unannounced. She had told herself she would wait a week, see how things played out. But she didn't trust them. Not yet. Mrs. Peterson, the principal, looked up in surprise when Marian walked into her office. "Mrs. Dawson," she said, a strained smile on her face. "I wasn't expecting you." "I figured," Marian said, sitting down without being invited. "I want to know what steps you've taken since our last conversation." Mrs. Peterson sighed, as if this was already exhausting her. "Well, we've spoken to the students involved," she said. "We made it clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." "And," Marian pressed. Mrs. Peterson hesitated. "And we've implemented a classroom discussion on kindness and inclusion. Mr. Roberts is leading it." Marian narrowed her eyes. A discussion. That was their solution. "Mrs. Dawson," Mrs. Peterson continued, clearly sensing her disappointment. "I understand that you want immediate change, but these things take time." Marian clenched her fists under the table. Time. That was always the excuse, wasn't it? "We don't have time," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "My son has been miserable for weeks. How many more weeks do you think he should endure?" Mrs. Peterson pursed her lips. "We're doing the best we can." "No," Marian said, shaking her head. "You're doing the bare minimum. There's a difference." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Mrs. Peterson exhaled and leaned forward. "What do you want us to do, Mrs. Dawson?" Marian was ready for this. She had spent all night thinking about it. "First," she said, "I want accountability. Not just for the kids who did this, but for the adults who let it happen." Mr. Roberts missed it. The lunch staff missed it. The playground monitors missed it. How? Mrs. Peterson opened her mouth, but Marian cut her off. "I want actual training for your staff. Not just a memo about being more aware. I want real training on spotting bullying, stopping it, and making sure kids like Eric don't slip through the cracks." Mrs. Peterson's expression shifted. She wasn't expecting this. "Second," Marian continued, "I want an anti-bullying program. A real one. Not just a poster in the hallway. Assemblies, workshops, small group discussions led by professionals. Something that actually makes these kids think about what they're doing." Mrs. Peterson's fingers tapped against her desk. "That would take time, too." "I don't care how long it takes," Marian interrupted. "Start it. Now." Mrs. Peterson looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't used to parents like Marian. Most parents got upset, yelled a little, then left. Marian wasn't going anywhere. Finally, Mrs. Peterson sighed. "I'll bring it up with the school board," she said, "but I can't make any promises." Marian stood. "Then I'll bring it up myself." She walked out, leaving the principal staring after her. Eric's silent struggle. That evening, Marian found Eric sitting on the couch, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the TV without really watching it. She sat beside him, brushing a hand over his hair. "Hey, kiddo." He gave her a half smile, but didn't speak. She hesitated before saying, "I went to your school today." Eric's shoulders tensed. "Mom, I just wanted to make sure they were taking this seriously," she said gently. "And I think they are. But I need to know, has anything changed?" Eric was quiet for a long time. Then finally, he shrugged. "Jason said sorry." Marian nodded. "That's good." Eric picked at a loose thread in his sleeve. "But the others, they still whisper about me." Marian's heart clenched. "They're not laughing as much," Eric added, "but I hear them." A lump formed in Marian's throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Eric looked up at her, his eyes tired but grateful. "You're trying," he said. "That's more than anyone else has ever done." And that broke her heart even more. Mr. Roberts steps up. The next week, something unexpected happened. Eric's teacher changed. Not physically, but something had shifted in him. During class, he didn't just stand at the front and teach. He moved through the rows, watching closely. When Jason hesitated before partnering with Eric, Mr. Roberts raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem, Jason?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Jason turned red and quickly shook his head. "No, sir." And that was that. At lunch, when another student rolled his eyes as Eric approached, Mr. Roberts casually sat down next to him. "Hey, Eric," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tell me about that book you're always reading." And suddenly, everyone was listening. Because if the teacher thought Eric was interesting, maybe he was. Small steps. But Marian noticed. She noticed when Eric didn't look so small when he walked into school anymore. She noticed when he actually talked about his day instead of mumbling one-word answers. She noticed when, one afternoon, Jason hesitated by their car. And then, awkwardly, he muttered, "See you tomorrow, Eric." Not as a joke. As an actual goodbye. Eric blinked. Then, hesitantly, he said, "See you." Marian's eyes stung. They weren't there yet. But for the first time, in a long time, she felt hope. The ripple effect. The changes at school were small at first, but Marian saw them. Eric didn't slump in his seat as much on the drive to school. He still didn't talk much, but there was something different about the way he carried himself. Like he wasn't bracing for impact every time he walked through those doors. It wasn't just Jason's hesitant apology. It wasn't just Mr. Roberts finally doing his job. It was something bigger. The whispers hadn't stopped entirely, but they were quieter. The laughter that once followed Eric's every move had dimmed. And that meant something. But Marian wasn't done yet, because surviving wasn't enough. She wanted Eric to thrive. And she was about to make sure the school knew it. The parents' meeting. The first thing Marian did was reach out to other parents. She didn't expect much. Most parents weren't like her. They were busy. They trusted the school to handle things. But something strange happened. When she sent out an email, explaining, without too many details, that the school needed to do more to prevent bullying, she got responses. Lots of them. At first, a few parents reached out, hesitant but interested. Then a few more. By the end of the week, she had a dozen parents asking, "How can we help?" So Marian set up a meeting. That Friday evening, she stood in the school's small library, looking at the group of parents who had shown up. Some she recognized from pickup duty, others she had never spoken to before. But they were here. That meant something. "Thank you all for coming," she said, clearing her throat. "I know we're all busy, but I think this is important." A murmur of agreement passed through the group. One father, a tall man with a buzz cut, crossed his arms. "What exactly are we talking about here?" Marian met his eyes. "Making sure our kids are safe." That got their attention. She explained, without naming names, that bullying wasn't just some minor inconvenience. It was breaking kids down, making them dread coming to school. And the school wasn't doing enough. We need more than just a talk about kindness, she said. We need real programs, real accountability, and we need to make sure that no child slips through the cracks. A woman near the front nodded. My daughter comes home crying almost every week because some girls keep excluding her. When I brought it up to her teacher, she said, "That's just how kids are." A few others muttered in agreement. Another mother spoke up. My son has ADHD. The other kids call him stupid because he struggles with reading. The teacher says she's working on it, but nothing changes. Marian took a deep breath. That's why we need to work together. By the time the meeting ended, they had a plan. Letters to the school board, petitions for a real anti-bullying initiative, and, if necessary, public pressure. Marian was done playing nice. This school was about to change. The unlikely ally. The next Monday, Marian found herself sitting in the principal's office again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Mr. Roberts was there, looking more tired than usual, but different. Determined. "I want to help," he said simply. Marian raised an eyebrow. "You do?" He nodded. "Look, I messed up. I missed it. I was so focused on teaching the material that I didn't see what was happening right under my nose. That's on me." Marian folded her arms. "So what's changed?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Eric." Marian stiffened. "He's different now," Mr. Roberts continued. At first, he barely spoke. He never raised his hand. He avoided eye contact. But now, he leaned forward. He volunteered to answer a question today. First time since he got here. Marian's heart clenched. It was such a small thing. But it wasn't. Not for Eric. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen again," Mr. Roberts said. "Not just for Eric, but for any kid." Marian studied him. She had been ready for a fight, ready to demand more. But for the first time, she didn't have to. Because someone else was fighting too. And that meant she wasn't alone anymore. Eric's first friend. That afternoon, when Marian picked Eric up from school, something was different. He wasn't walking alone. Jason was beside him. Talking. Actually talking. Marian's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She held her breath as Eric opened the car door and climbed in. "Hey, sweetheart," she said carefully. "Hey, Mom." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Jason invited me to sit with him at lunch tomorrow." Marian almost slammed the brakes, even though they weren't moving. "What?" she said, trying to keep her voice even. Eric shifted in his seat. He said he was wrong about me. That he never really knew me before. Marian's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, to tell him how proud she was, to tell him how much she loved him. But all she could do was reach over and squeeze his hand. And for the first time, in a long time, he squeezed back. The school board meeting. 2 weeks later, Marian sat in front of the school board. The parents from her meeting sat behind her. Mr. Roberts was there too. And Eric. She had asked if he wanted to come, and to her surprise, he had said yes. Mrs. Peterson, the principal, looked uncomfortable. She hadn't expected this many people. But Marian didn't care. She took a deep breath and began. "We're here today because this school has a problem," she said. "A problem that has gone ignored for too long." She saw the board members shift uncomfortably. She didn't stop. She told them everything. The bullying, the lack of response, the way kids were slipping through the cracks. Then she let the other parents speak. One by one, they shared their stories. By the time they were done, the school board looked shaken. Finally, one of them cleared his throat. "What do you propose?" Marian looked them dead in the eye. "A real anti-bullying program," she said. "Not just a speech in the gym. Small group discussions, workshops, monthly check-ins with students, and most importantly, accountability." Silence filled the room. Then, finally, a board member nodded. "We'll make it happen." The beginning of something new. The next day, Marion walked Eric to the bus stop. He didn't look afraid. He didn't flinch when a group of kids walked past. And when Jason arrived, he actually smiled. "Hey, Eric," Jason said. "Wanna sit with me again?" Eric hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." As the bus pulled away, Marion wiped a tear from her eye. It wasn't over. There would still be bad days. But today was good. And for the first time, Eric believed that there would be more good days ahead. The strength to keep going. As the bus disappeared down the street, Marion let out a long breath, her chest still tight with emotion. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. Change was slow. Some days, it felt impossible. But Eric had taken a step forward. The school had started listening. The parents had rallied together. And Marion, she was just getting started. The classroom shift. Eric's classroom had never been a place of comfort. It had been a battlefield, one where he had learned to keep his head down, stay quiet, and avoid being noticed. But now things were different. When Eric walked in that morning, he saw something strange. Mr. Roberts had rearranged the seating chart. The cliques had been broken up. The kids who had once whispered and snickered together were now sitting apart, forced to interact with different classmates. And Eric, he wasn't in the farthest corner of the room anymore. He was closer to the front, closer to Jason. At first, he wasn't sure how to feel about that. But then Jason turned to him and muttered, "This is kinda better, right?" Eric hesitated, then nodded. Maybe it was. The power of one small gesture. At lunch, Eric found himself at Jason's table again. He still felt awkward, unsure. Like any moment, the kindness could be ripped away. But then, one of Jason's friends sat down across from him. Eric tensed. He had seen this boy before, Tyler. He had laughed at him, made fun of him. But now Tyler was looking at Jason, confused. "Wait, you guys are friends now?" Jason hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah, kinda." Tyler frowned. "But like, he doesn't even talk." Eric felt his stomach sink. But before he could say anything, Jason spoke. Maybe 'cause no one ever let him. The table went quiet. Tyler shifted uncomfortably, looking at Eric for the first time like he was actually seeing him. And then, instead of saying something cruel, he muttered, "Huh, I never thought about that." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't some grand realization. But it was something. A crack in the wall. A tiny shift in how they saw him. And for the first time in a long time, Eric didn't feel like the joke of the table. He felt like he belonged there. Even just a little. The principal's next move. That afternoon, Marion's phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Principal Peterson. Marion exhaled sharply before answering. "Hello." "Mrs. Dawson," Mrs. Peterson said, her tone more formal than usual. "I wanted to update you on some things." Marion folded her arms. "I'm listening." "I've spoken to the school board," Mrs. Peterson continued. "They've agreed to start implementing an anti-bullying initiative." Marion's heart leaped. "Really?" "Yes. We're working on bringing in professionals to lead discussions. Teachers will receive additional training on how to recognize and intervene in bullying situations." Marion pressed the phone closer to her ear. This was real. It was happening. Additionally, Mrs. Peterson continued, "We're introducing student-led mentorship programs. Older students will be paired with younger ones who need support. We want to foster an environment where kids look out for each other." Marion blinked. That sounded good. Really good. She had expected resistance, more red tape, more excuses. But instead, actual action. "Thank you," Marion said, her voice softer than she expected. Mrs. Peterson hesitated, then sighed. "I should be the one thanking you, Mrs. Dawson," she admitted. "We should have been doing this a long time ago." For the first time, Marion heard something real in her voice. Regret. And that was enough. For now. The moment Eric realized he wasn't alone. That evening, Eric sat at the kitchen table, working on his homework. Marian watched him from across the room, stirring a pot of pasta. Then, something strange happened. Eric let out a quiet laugh. It was small, almost nothing. But Marian froze, her hand gripping the spoon tightly. She turned to see him holding his phone, smiling. Not forced, not awkward. Real. Something funny? She asked, trying to sound casual. Eric glanced up, his smile still there. Still there. Jason sent me a meme, he said. Marian's heart ached in the best way. Jason had sent him a meme. Because that's what friends do. Eric had never had that before. Never had someone send him something just to make him laugh. And now he did. And suddenly, all the fights, all the meetings, all the sleepless nights, they were worth it. Because her son was smiling. And maybe, just maybe, that smile was here to stay. The fight isn't over. But they're winning. The next few weeks weren't perfect. There were still bad days, still kids who muttered things under their breath. But now, Eric wasn't alone. Now when someone said something cruel, Jason rolled his eyes and said, "Dude, shut up." And sometimes, the other kids agreed. Now, when Mr. Roberts noticed someone getting pushed around, he actually stepped in. Now the school had posters and programs, discussions that meant something. It was slow, but it was happening. One small change at a time. And Marian, she was still watching, still making sure the school kept their promises, still making sure Eric never felt invisible again. And as she sat across from him at dinner that night, listening to him tell her about his day, she knew one thing for sure. She had won this battle. And as long as Eric needed her, she'd win the next one too. The unbreakable bond. The world didn't change overnight. Not for Eric, not for Marian, and not for the school. But something had shifted. For the first time in months, Eric didn't wake up dreading school. He didn't sit in the car, staring out the window like he was bracing for a battle he couldn't win. And when he walked through those school doors, he wasn't alone. Jason walked beside him. And that was everything. But Marian knew the fight wasn't over. Because for every small victory, there was still a system that had let her son suffer for so long. And she wasn't about to let that happen to someone else. The school takes its first big step. 2 weeks after the school board meeting, Marian received an email from Mrs. Peterson. Subject: Bullying Prevention Initiative. Parent volunteers needed. Marian's eyes scanned the message quickly. The school was launching its first official anti-bullying program. They were bringing in speakers, hosting workshops, training teachers, and they wanted parent volunteers. Her heart pounded. This was happening. She read the last part of the email twice. "We would love for you to be involved, Mrs. Dawson. Your voice helped make this possible." Marian swallowed hard. She had fought for this. Now she had to decide if she was ready to step even deeper into it. She clicked reply. "I'm in." Eric's first big test. A week later, Eric sat at lunch, picking at his food, while Jason scrolled through his phone. "So, my cousin sent me this video of a guy eating 50 hot wings in, like 5 minutes, Jason said. Dude almost passed out. Eric smirked. Sounds painful. It was painful. He literally started crying. Then it happened. A kid from another table turned and muttered just loud enough for them to hear. Can't believe Jason's friends with him. Eric's stomach dropped. For a second, it was like nothing had changed, like he was back in the shadows. Then, Jason turned around. "What's your problem?" he said, voice sharp. The kid blinked. "I don't have a problem." "Yeah, you do," Jason said, shoving his phone into his pocket. "You keep talking about my friend like he's not right here. Say it to his face." Eric's face burned. He wasn't used to this. Wasn't used to someone standing up for him. The kid rolled his eyes. Relax, I was just saying. Jason's expression didn't change. Nah, you were being a jerk. Just stop. And then, something even crazier happened. Tyler, the same kid who used to laugh at Eric, nudged Jason's shoulder and said, "Forget him. Man, let's go." Tyler was on his side. The kid muttered something under his breath, but turned away. And just like that, it was over. Eric sat there, stunned. Jason turned back to him like nothing had happened. "Anyway," he said, pulling out his phone again. "You ever think you could eat 50 wings?" Eric blinked. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Maybe 10. Jason grinned. Weak. And just like that, it wasn't him against the world anymore. He had people in his corner. For the first time in his life, he belonged. The first parent-teacher meeting. That evening, Marion sat in a circle of parents and teachers in the school's library. They were here for the first official bullying prevention task force. Marion could hardly believe it. She recognized some of the parents from the first meeting. Others were new. And at the front of the group, standing beside Mrs. Peterson, was Mr. Roberts. "I want to start by saying I appreciate all of you for being here," Mrs. Peterson said. "This is an important step in making sure our students feel safe and supported." Mr. Roberts cleared his throat. "I also want to acknowledge that as teachers, we haven't always done enough. But that changes now." Marion's breath caught in her throat. That was huge. Not just for Eric. For every kid who had ever been ignored. The meeting went on for over an hour. They discussed new training programs for staff, plans for peer mentorship programs, monthly check-ins for students. And then Mrs. Peterson turned to Marion. "I'd also like to invite Mrs. Dawson to share her story," she said, "because none of this would be happening without her." All eyes turned to her. Marion's stomach twisted. She had never been one for public speaking. But then she thought of Eric. Of the way he had glowed when Jason stood up for him today. So she took a deep breath and spoke. "I think a lot of us assume our kids are fine until we realize they aren't," she said. "I assumed Eric was fine, until he wasn't. And by the time I saw what was happening, he had already learned to hide it." The room was silent. Marion swallowed hard. "I had to fight to make this school see what was happening. And I know my son wasn't the only one. That's why this program matters." She looked at the parents, the teachers, the administrators. "If we do this right, if we really commit to this, then maybe, just maybe, the next kid won't have to suffer in silence." Silence. Then, slowly, a parent began clapping. Then another. And another. Until the whole room erupted in applause. A mother and son rebuild. That night, as Marion sat on the couch with a warm cup of tea, she heard footsteps behind her. Eric. She turned, surprised to see him still awake. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I just wanted to say thanks." Marion frowned. "For what?" Eric shifted awkwardly. "For everything." Marion's heart clenched. This was new. Eric had never been the kind of kid to say things outright. He had always been the quiet one, the one who held his emotions close. But now he was standing there, looking at her with something in his eyes he hadn't seen in so long, something she had missed so much. Trust. He trusted her again. Because she had fought for him. Because she hadn't given up. Marion set her tea down and pulled him into a hug. For the first time, in a long time, he let her, and for the first time, in a long time, she knew they were going to be okay. The final step forward. The next day, as Marion watched Eric walk into school, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. It wasn't over. There would still be bad days, still challenges, still moments where Eric felt out of place. But now, he knew he wasn't alone. And that changed everything. As Marion drove away, she smiled to herself. She had fought for her son, and she'd do it again in a heartbeat, because that's what mothers do. And this was just the beginning of something better. For Eric, for his school, for all of them. A new chapter begins. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marian woke up without a weight on her chest. No fear gnawed at her. No restless, sleepless nights. No waking up in a panic, wondering how her son would survive another day at school. Because for the first time in a long time, Eric wasn't just surviving. He was living. She heard him moving around in his room, zipping up his backpack. No dragging footsteps. No long sighs. No dread. And when he finally came into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes and plopping into a chair at the table, she saw it. The change. He looked lighter. Not happy, exactly. That would take time. But hopeful. That was more than she ever could have asked for. Marian smiled as she slid a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. You ready for school? Eric glanced up. He hesitated. Then, he nodded. Not because he had to. Because he actually meant it. The small, powerful moments. Eric had started to rebuild his life at school piece by piece. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some sudden transformation. But Marian saw it. She saw it in the way he walked down the school hallway, no longer pressing himself against the lockers to stay out of the way. She saw it in the way Jason waved him over to sit with their group at lunch, like it was the most normal thing in the world. She saw it when Tyler, once one of his tormentors, bumped his shoulder and said, "Yo, you coming to the basketball game Friday?" Eric had blinked at him in shock, and Tyler, without missing a beat, had shrugged. "You should. Jason's playing." A few months ago, Eric would have turned and walked away, convinced it was a joke. But now he hesitated. Then said, "Maybe." And the best part, Tyler grinned. Cool. Like Eric being included was just normal. Like that's the way it had always been. Like he had always belonged. The letter that changed everything. One afternoon, Marian was sorting through the mail when she saw it. A thick envelope, with the school's logo in the corner. She frowned and ripped it open. Inside, there was a neatly folded letter. She sat down and began to read. Dear Mrs. Dawson, I wanted to personally thank you for your dedication, persistence, and passion in advocating for the students at our school. As you know, we've taken significant steps toward improving how we address bullying, fostering inclusion, and ensuring every child feels safe in our classrooms. These changes would not have happened without you. With that in mind, we would like to invite you to take on an official role as part of our Parent Advisory Board on student well-being. Your leadership, insights, and determination have already made a difference, and we believe your continued involvement will help shape the future of this school. Please let us know if you would be interested in joining. With gratitude, Carolyn Peterson, Principal. Marian stared at the letter for a long time. Her hands trembled as she set it down. She had fought for her son. She had fought for change. And now, she was being asked to help lead it. She didn't have to think twice. She grabbed her phone, pulled up Mrs. Peterson's email, and typed 2 words. I'm in. The night that brought it all full circle. That Friday, Eric stood in front of the bathroom mirror, running a hand through his hair. Marian watched from the doorway, arms crossed, smiling. You sure you're ready for this? She asked. Eric met her eyes in the mirror. And for the first time in a long time, she saw confidence there. Yeah, he said. He grabbed his jacket, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and turned to face her. I'm going to the game. Marian blinked. You are. Jason's playing, Eric said casually. He asked if I wanted to sit with his friends. There was a hesitation in his voice, like he was still trying to convince himself it was real, like he was afraid the moment would be ripped away. But Marian saw it. He wanted this. He was taking his first real step forward. And this time, it was all his choice. She walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you." Eric swallowed, then gave a small, lopsided grin. "I know. A victory that was never just about one kid." When Marion dropped Eric off at the school that night, she watched as he walked toward the gym entrance. Jason was already waiting for him, waving him over. And without hesitation, Eric jogged to meet him. She sat there for a moment, just watching. Watching her son take back his life. Watching him stand beside a friend, laughing like it was the most natural thing in the world. And that's when it hit her. This fight, this battle she had waged for weeks, it was never just about Eric. It was about every kid who had ever felt small. Every kid who had walked through those school doors feeling like they had no place in the world. And now, because of her fight, because of Eric's strength, because of the school finally waking up, the next kid who walked into this school wouldn't have to fight so hard to be seen. And that was the biggest victory of all. The final goodbye to the past. That night, when Eric got home, something strange happened. He walked into the living room, dropped his backpack and said, "Mom, do you want to hear something crazy?" Marion raised an eyebrow. "Always." He sat down across from her, hands on his knees. "Tonight at the game." He hesitated, like he almost couldn't believe it himself. "Tyler called me his friend." Marion's heart clenched. Eric looked up at her. He meant it. And just like that, everything came full circle. The bullying, the silence, the pain, all of it had led here. To this moment, to a boy who had once believed he would always be alone. Finally knowing that he wasn't, Marion reached over and took his hand. And for the first time in months, Eric smiled. Not just a small, hesitant grin. A real smile. The kind she hadn't seen since before all of this started. And as she squeezed his hand, she knew one thing for certain. Her son was going to be okay. And no matter what came next, he would never face it alone. The end, and the beginning of something better. The past couldn't be erased. The pain had been real. The struggle had been long. But in the end, they had won. And now they were stepping into something new. Something better. Something filled with hope. For Eric. For the school. For every kid who had ever felt like they didn't belong. Because now, they did. And that made all the difference.